Section 37 of the Expedition of Humphry Clinker. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit librivox.org. Recording by Martin Geeson. The Expedition of Humphry Clinker by Tobias Smollett. Section 37. To Sir WATKIN PHILLIPS of Jesus College, Oxford. Dear Wat, I mentioned in my last my uncle's design of going to the Duke of N's levee, which design has been executed accordingly. His Grace has been so long accustomed to this kind of homage, that though the place he fills does not imply the 10th part of the influence which he exerted in his former office, he has given his friends to understand that they cannot oblige him in anything more than in contributing to support the shadow of that power, which he no longer retains in substance, and therefore he has still public days on which they appear at his levee. My uncle and I went thither with Mr. Barton, who, being one of the Duke's adherents, undertook to be our introducer. The room was pretty well filled with people in a great variety of dress, but there was no more than one gown and cassock, though I was told his Grace had, while he was minister, preferred almost every individual that now filled the bench of bishops in the House of Lords. But in all probability the gratitude of the clergy is like their charity, which shuns the light. Mr. Barton was immediately accosted by a person well stricken in years, tall and raw-boned, with a hook nose and an arch leer, that indicated at least as much cunning as sagacity. Our conductor saluted him by the name of Captain C, and afterwards informed us he was a man of shrewd parts, whom the government occasionally employed in secret services. But I have had the history of him more at large from another quarter. He had been many years ago concerned in fraudulent practices as a merchant in France, and being convicted of some of them, was sent to the galleys, from whence he was delivered by the interest of the late Duke of Ormond, to whom he had recommended himself in letter as his namesake and relation. He was in the sequel employed by our ministry as a spy, and in the war of 1740 traversed all Spain as well as France in the disguise of a Capuchin, at the extreme hazard of his life, inasmuch as the court of Madrid had actually got scent of him and given orders to apprehend him at St. Sebastian's, from whence he had fortunately retired but a few hours before the order arrived. This and other hairbreadth scapes he pleaded so effectually as a merit with the English ministry, that they allowed him a comfortable pension, which he now enjoys in his old age. He has still access to all the ministers, and is said to be consulted by them on many subjects, as a man of uncommon understanding and great experience. He is, in fact, a fellow of some parts and invincible assurance, and in his discourse he assumes such an air of self-sufficiency as may very well impose upon some of the shallow politicians who now labour at the helm of administration. But if he is not belied, this is not the only imposture of which he is guilty. They say he is at bottom not only a Roman Catholic, but really a priest, and while he pretends to disclose to our state pilots all the springs that move the cabinet of Versailles, he is actually picking up intelligence for the service of the French minister. Be that as it may, Captain C entered into conversation with us in the most familiar manner, and treated the Duke's character without any ceremony. "This wiseacre," said he, "is still abed, and I think the best thing he can do is to sleep on till Christmas, for when he gets up he does nothing but expose his own folly. Since Grenville was turned out, there has been no minister in this nation worth the meal that whitened his periwig. They are so ignorant, they scarce know a crab from a cauliflower; and then they are such dunces, that there's no making them comprehend the plainest proposition. In the beginning of the war, this poor half-witted creature told me in a great fright that 30,000 French had marched from Acadie to Cape Breton. Where did they find transports? Said I. Transports, cried he. I tell you they marched by land. By land to the island of Cape Breton. What, is Cape Breton an island? Certainly. Ha! Are you sure of that? When I pointed it out in the map, he examined it earnestly with his spectacles, then taking me in his arms, "My dear C," cried he, "you always bring us good news. Egad, I'll go directly and tell the king that Cape Breton is an island." He seemed disposed to entertain us with more anecdotes of this nature at the expense of his grace, when he was interrupted by the arrival of the Algerine ambassador, a venerable Turk with a long white beard, attended by his dragoman or interpreter, and another officer of his household, who had got no stockings to his legs. Captain C immediately spoke with an air of authority to a servant in waiting, bidding him go and tell the Duke to rise, as there was a great deal of company come, and among others the ambassador from Algiers. Then, turning to us, "This poor Turk," said he, "notwithstanding his grey beard, is a greenhorn. He has been several years resident in London, and still is ignorant of our political revolutions. This visit is intended for the Prime Minister of England, but you'll see how this wise Duke will receive it as a mark of attachment to his own person." Certain it is the Duke seemed eager to acknowledge the compliment. A door opened, he suddenly bolted out, with a shaving cloth under his chin, his face frothed up to the eyes with soap lather, and running up to the ambassador, grinned hideous in his face. "My dear Mahomet," said he, "God love your long beard. I hope the day will make you a horsetail at the next promotion. Ha, ha, ha! Have but a moment's patience, and I'll send to you in a twinkling." So saying, he retired into his den, leaving the Turk in some confusion. After a short pause, however, he said something to his interpreter, the meaning of which I had great curiosity to know, as he turned up his eyes while he spoke, expressing astonishment mixed with devotion. We were gratified by means of the communicative Captain C, who conversed with the dragoman as an old acquaintance. Ibrahim, the ambassador, who had mistaken his grace for the minister's fool, was no sooner undeceived by the interpreter than he exclaimed to this effect: "Holy prophet, I don't wonder that this nation prospers, seeing it is governed by the council of idiots, a series of men whom all good Mussulmen revere as the organs of immediate inspiration." Ibrahim was favoured with a particular audience of short duration, after which the Duke conducted him to the door, and then returned to diffuse his gracious looks among the crowd of his worshippers. As Mr. Barton advanced to present me to his grace, it was my fortune to attract his notice before I was announced. He forthwith met me more than half way, and seizing me by the hand, "My dear Sir Francis," cried he, "this is so kind. I vow to God I am so obliged. Such attention to a poor broken minister. Well, pray, when does your excellency set sail? For God's sake have a care of your health, and eat stewed prunes in the passage. Next to your own precious health, pray, my dear excellency, take care of the Five Nations. Our good friends, the Five Nations, the Tory-Rorys, the McColmacks, the out-of-the-ways, the Crickets, and the Kickshaws. Let 'em have plenty of blankets, and stinkubus, and wampum, and your excellency won't fail to scour the kettle, and boil the chain, and bury the tree, and plant the hatchet. Ha, ha, ha!" When he had uttered this rhapsody, with his usual precipitation, Mr Barton gave him to understand that I was neither Sir Francis nor Saint Francis, but simply Mr Melford, nephew to Mr Bramble, who, stepping forward, made his bow at the same time. "Odd so! No more it is, Sir Francis," said this wise statesman. "Mr Melford, I'm glad to see you. I sent you an engineer to fortify your dock. Mr Bramble, your servant, Mr Bramble. How do ye, good Mr Bramble? Your nephew is a pretty young fellow. Faith and troth, a very pretty fellow. His father is my old friend. How does he hold it? Still troubled with that damned disorder, huh?" "No, my lord," replied my uncle, "all his troubles are over. He has been dead these 15 years. "Dead? Ha! Yes, faith, now I remember, he is dead, sure enough. Well, and how does the young gentleman stand for Haverfordwest? Or what do ye? My dear Mr Milford Haven, I'll do you all the service in my power. I hope I have some credit left." My uncle then gave him to understand that I was still a minor, and that we had no intention to trouble him at present for any favour whatsoever. "I came hither with my nephew," added he, "to pay our respects to your grace, and I may venture to say, that his views and mine are at least as disinterested as those of any individual in this assembly." "My dear Mr Brambleberry, you do me infinite honour. I shall always rejoice to see you and your hopeful nephew, Mr Milford Haven. My credit, such as it is, you may command. I wish we had more friends of your kidney." Then, turning to Captain C, "Ha, C!" said he, "what news, C? How does the world wag, ha?" "The world wags much after the old fashion, my lord," answered the captain. "The politicians of London and Westminster have begun again to wag their tongues against your grace, and your short-lived popularity wags like a feather which the next puff of anti-ministerial calumny will blow away." "A pack of rascals!" cried the duke. "Tories, Jacobites, rebels! One half of them would wag their heels at Tyburn if they had their deserts." So saying, he wheeled about, and going round the levee, spoke to every individual with the most courteous familiarity. But he scarce ever opened his mouth without making some blunder, in relation to the person or business of the party with whom he conversed; so that he really looked like a comedian, hired to burlesque the character of a minister. At length, a person of very prepossessing appearance coming in, his grace ran up, and hugging him in his arms with the appellation of "my dear led him forthwith into the inner apartment, or sanctum sanctorum, of this political temple. "That," said Captain C, "is my friend C.T., almost the only man of parts who has any concern in the present administration. Indeed, he would have no concern at all in the matter if the ministry did not find it absolutely necessary to make use of his talents upon some particular occasions. As for the common business of the nation, it is carried on in a constant routine by the clerks of the different offices, otherwise the wheels of government would be wholly stopped amidst the abrupt succession of ministers, every one more ignorant than his predecessor. I am thinking what a fine hovel we should be in if all the clerks of the Treasury, the secretaries of the War Office and the Admiralty should take it in their heads to throw up their places in imitation of the great pensioner. But to return to C.T. He certainly knows more than all the ministry and all the opposition if their heads were laid together, and talks like an angel on a vast variety of subjects. He would really be a great man if he had any consistency or stability of character. Then it must be owned he wants courage, otherwise he would never allow himself to be cowed by the great political bully, for whose understanding he has justly a very great contempt. I have seen him as much afraid of that overbearing Hector as ever schoolboy was of his pedagogue, and yet this Hector, I shrewdly suspect, is no more than a craven at bottom. Besides this defect, C has another, which he is at too little pains to hide. There's no faith to be given to his assertions, and no trust to be put in his promises. However, to give the devil his due, he's very good-natured, and even friendly when close urged in the way of solicitation. As for principle, that's out of the question. In a word, he is a wit and an orator, extremely entertaining, and he shines very often at the expense even of those ministers to whom he is a retainer. This is a mark of great imprudence, by which he has made them all his enemies, whatever face they may put upon the matter, and sooner or later he'll have cause to wish he had been able to keep his own counsel. I have several times cautioned him upon this subject, but 'tis all preaching to the desert. His vanity runs away with his discretion. I could not help thinking the captain himself might have been the better for some hints of the same nature. His panegyric, excluding principle and veracity, puts me in mind of a contest I once overheard, in the way of altercation, betwixt two apple women in Spring Garden. One of those viragos, having hinted something to the prejudice of the other's moral character, her antagonist, setting her hands in her sides, replied, "Speak out, hussy, I scorn your malice. I own I'm both a whore and a thief, and what more have you to say? Damn you, what more have you to say? Bating that which all the world knows, I challenge you to say black is the white of my eye." We did not wait for Mr. T.'s coming forth, but after Captain C. had characterized all the originals in waiting, we adjourned to a coffee house, where we had buttered muffins and tea to breakfast, the said captain still favouring us with his company. Nay, my uncle was so diverted with his anecdotes, that he asked him to dinner, and treated him with a fine turbot, to which he did ample justice. That same evening I spent at the tavern with some friends, one of whom let me into C.'s character, which Mr. Bramble no sooner understood than he expressed some concern for the connection he had made, and resolved to disengage himself from it without ceremony. We are become members of the Society for the Encouragement of the Arts, and have assisted at some of their deliberations, which were conducted with equal spirit and sagacity. My uncle is extremely fond of the institution, which will certainly be productive of great advantages to the public, if from its democratical form it does not degenerate into cabal and corruption. You are already acquainted with his aversion to the influence of the multitude, which he affirms is incompatible with excellence and subversive of order. Indeed, his detestation of the mob has been heightened by fear, ever since he fainted in the room at Bath, and this apprehension has prevented him from going to the little theatre in the Haymarket, and other places of entertainment, to which, however, I have had the honour to attend the ladies. It grates old Squaretoes to reflect that it is not in his power to enjoy even the most elegant diversions of the capital without the participation of the vulgar, for they now thrust themselves into all assemblies, from a ridotto at St. James's to a hop at Rotherhithe. I have lately seen our old acquaintance, Dick Ivy, who we imagined had died of dram drinking, but he is lately emerged from the Fleet by means of a pamphlet which he wrote and published against the government with some success. The sale of this performance enabled him to appear in clean linen, and he is now going about soliciting subscriptions for his poems, but his breeches are not yet in the most decent order. Dick certainly deserves some countenance for his intrepidity and perseverance. It is not in the power of disappointment, nor even of damnation, to drive him to despair. After some unsuccessful essays in the way of poetry, he commenced brandy merchant, and I believe his whole stock ran out through his own bowels, and then he consorted with a milkwoman who kept a cellar in petty France, but he could not make his quarters good. He was dislodged and driven upstairs into the kennel by a corporal in the 2nd Regiment of Foot Guards. He was afterwards the laureate of Blackfriars, from whence there was a natural transition to the Fleet. As he had formerly miscarried in panegyric, he now turned his thoughts to satire, and really seems to have some talent for abuse. If he can hold out till the meeting of the Parliament, and be prepared for another charge, in all probability Dick will mount the pillory, or obtain a pension, in either of which events his fortune will be made. Meanwhile he has acquired some degree of consideration with the respectable writers of the age, and as I have subscribed for his works, he did me the favour t'other night to introduce me to a society of those geniuses; but I found them exceedingly formal and reserved. They seemed afraid and jealous of one another, and sat in a state of mutual repulsion, like so many particles of vapour, each surrounded by its own electrified atmosphere. Dick, who has more vivacity than judgment, tried more than once to enliven the conversation, sometimes making an effort at wit, sometimes letting off a pun, and sometimes discharging a conundrum. Nay, at length he started a dispute upon the hackneyed comparison between blank verse and rhyme, and the professors opened with great clamour. But instead of keeping to the subject, they launched out into tedious dissertations on the poetry of the ancients, and one of them, who had been a schoolmaster, displayed his whole knowledge of prosody, gleaned from Disputer and Ruddiman. At last I ventured to say, I did not see how the subject in question could be at all elucidated by the practice of the ancients, who certainly had neither blank verse nor rhyme in their poems, which were measured by feet, whereas ours are reckoned by the number of syllables. This remark seemed to give umbrage to the pedant, who forthwith involved himself in a cloud of Greek and Latin quotations, which nobody attempted to dispel. A confused hum of insipid observations and comments ensued, and upon the whole I never passed a duller evening in my life. Yet without all doubt some of them were men of learning, wit, and ingenuity. As they are afraid of making free with one another, they should bring each his butt or whetstone along with him for the entertainment of the company. My uncle says he never desires to meet with more than one wit at a time. One wit, like a knuckle of ham in soup, gives a zest and flavour to the dish, but more than one serves only to spoil the pottage. And now I'm afraid I have given you an unconscionable mess, without any flavour at all. for which I suppose you will bestow your benedictions upon your friend and servant, J. Melford. London, June 5th. Section 37.